Welcome back to Transform Your Workplace. This show exists to help leaders build healthier workplaces where people feel supported, understood, and able to do their best work. Every episode is about giving you ideas and tools that make the human side of work a little easier and a lot more meaningful. This episode is sponsored by Xenium HR. And before we jump in, I want you to know that Xenium just released the full lineup of 2026 workshops. These sessions cover communication, leadership, compliance, burnout prevention, and a whole lot more. If you want next year to be the year your team actually levels up, grab the calendar and download the schedule. See a link in the show notes. All right, today we're diving into a pretty unique topic, one that we haven't covered on this show before, and it's going to hit home for a lot of people, including myself. Dementia, Alzheimer's, caregiving, real life stuff that employees carry with them to work every single day. My guest is Lisa Skinner. She has spent 50 years in the world of dementia care, starting with her own grandmother and now professionally supporting families, training caregivers, and helping people understand what these diseases actually do to the brain. She is the best-selling author of Not All Who Wander Need to Be Lost and her newest book and workbook, Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's. What I loved about this conversation is how Lisa breaks down the behaviors we see, the myths that get in the way, and everyday moments that caregivers struggle with. She shares stories from her own family, including the emotional weight that shows up long before a diagnosis is formal. And she explained how to respond with empathy when a loved one is living in a reality that is different from ours. If you lead people, you need to hear this. Caregivers are in your workplace. They are on your teams. They are your managers, your high performers, and the folks you rely on. They are carrying invisible stress that compounds fast. In this episode, Lisa gives you tools to understand it, support it, and not make things worse. She also walks through the early warning signs, the difference between normal aging and something more serious, and the first actions families should take to prepare and protect themselves. This is one of those conversations I know will stick with you, so let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Lisa Skinner. Lisa, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for inviting me onto your show. I mean, we just kind of talked about it for a few minutes, but you're so right. It is such an important topic to bring to people's attention these days.
Yeah, you're doing a lot of work around the topic of Alzheimer's and bringing awareness. You wrote a book called Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's. Its Secret Faces, and it's co-authored with Douglas Collins. And you said you have a TV show, you have a podcast, so you're definitely out there. And when this topic came across my desk, I know personally so many people that have been affected by Alzheimer's or dementia. I mentioned to you my grandmother has dementia, and it's been in significant decline over the last few years. So I'm personally moved to learn more about it and also help people, like bring awareness to it. So that's why I wanted to have you on. I can't wait for this conversation. So thanks for coming on. What motivated you to write the book in the first place, though? What makes your approach in this book different than any clinical guide or any other resource might go about it differently?
Because I've been living in this world for 50 years, starting with my own grandmother, who's diagnosed with what they called back then senile dementia. And I had a just unbelievable experience with her, and I didn't even know she was sick. And it just knocked me off, my chair. And then I decided to pursue this professionally. I've since had 7 more family members, so 8 total. And I've been doing this professionally for 30 years now. So I have literally been in the weeds of, watching people decline and training caregivers and counseling families. And I saw a common theme that I have observed for the longest time, and it hasn't changed. And it's really people needing to have a clearer and more comprehensive understanding of exactly what this disease or these diseases do to the brains of people who are living with, like an Alzheimer's disease or a frontotemporal disease, because most people associate Alzheimer's disease and dementia with memory loss or short-term memory loss
Right.
and confusion. And it is so much more complex than that. And they see the symptoms, they see the behaviors, but it's almost like they're not connecting the dots that these peculiar behaviors that we see are part of the disease.
Mm-hmm.
And then in addition to that, okay, if my grandmother, and this is a true story, tells me that there are birds living in her mattress and coming out at night and pecking at her face, and that's exactly what my experience was. In addition to that, she was telling me to look all around her living room because there were rats running all over the place and men trying to break into her house. These are three examples of things that people witness and experience with their loved ones. So the second part of that is, how do you respond to those types of
Yeah.
things that they're claiming? That's a very skilled thing to learn because it's counterintuitive to the way we instinctively want to respond. So that's what I teach too. But to answer your question of what inspired me to write the book was really listening to families, probably for at least 20 years, telling me that they can't find any reliable information. Their doctors are not helpful. They don't tell them what to expect. They don't give them resources to fall back on. And so at the urging of the people that I worked with, I decided to literally put pen to paper and write a book that would help people have a better understanding of the disease and how to deal with the situations that arise on a daily basis.
As some of these signs and symptoms kind of show up, how could people tell the difference between what could be just normal aging, mild cognitive impairment, or actually this disease, dementia?
That's a great question. And part of what we're seeing is so challenging for medical professionals in finding a cure and a treatment, because in the very beginning stages of Alzheimer's disease or some of these other brain diseases that cause, these symptoms, these signs that we call dementia, and there's about 200 of these brain diseases.
Wow.
Yeah, it's shocking. But most everybody, relates to Alzheimer's disease because it is the most common one. But this is a true fact. Most people are not diagnosed until they're well into their mid stages because it is so difficult to differentiate between the normal aging forgetfulness process that all of us go through probably once we hit about 40 and something more serious like a brain disease starting to develop in their brain, or not starting, because people actually can live with a brain disease developing in their brain and be asymptomatic for 10 or 20 years. So, forgetting a person's name, or where did I set my phone down, or why did I walk in this room? Those are part of normal aging, and it's not to be concerned about. It's when those memory deficits start showing up more frequently and more severely that is a red flag to something more serious going on. So people won't typically be telling you that there are birds living in their mattress and that they're coming out at night and pecking at their face unless they do have dementia going on. That's not typically something people will start spouting out in the earlier stages, which could be just normal.
Yeah, you're so right. It's like oh, where did I forget my purse, or some basic things like that. It could just be normal aging.
Or where did I park my car?
Yeah, right. We all do that. I mean, I turned 40. Like you said, anybody above 40, they start to forget things. I do all the
Well,
time.
plus we're busy and we're so bombarded with information from all of the, places now, the news, social media, that our brains get kind of clogged up. So yeah, things like that, I say no need for concern yet. But if they really start interfering with your ability to function on a daily basis, then there's probably cause for concern and need to have an assessment by your primary care physician.
Is there, in your experience, is there any sort of things we could do at home, like a simple home screen test or something before we have to go, schedule an appointment at a clinic or anything, for a formal assessment?
So are you talking about like an adult child trying to determine if there's
Let's
really...
say I suspected somebody in my family, like they're forgetting a lot of things, and the things are just not adding up. Is there something I can do, whether it's questions to ask or some sort of at-home assessment to know if this is really a problem?
There are home assessments that you can pull off the internet, little cognitive tests. But one of the things that pretty commonly happens to look for is your loved one starting to ask the same question over and over again in the same conversation, or telling you the same story over and over again in the same conversation. That is a sure sign that there's something more serious going on, or they forget how to operate a simple appliance like a coffee maker that they've been turning on for decades. And all of a sudden, they can't remember how to operate it. And then noticing unpaid bills or having difficulty just writing out a simple grocery list. Things like that are signs. But if they're asking you constantly, what's the date today? Or is today Wednesday when it's really Saturday? And you're noticing things like that, then I would say that those are blatant signs and not just little subtle signs.
When you think about the perception of Alzheimer's and other, related dementias, what are some common myths that are out there that you would like to squash?
The one that upsets me and bothers me the most, and again, I've been working with people living with these diseases that cause dementia dating back to my grandma, so 50 years, plus professionally 30 years. The one that upsets me the most is that when people get to the latter stage of the progression of the decline with these diseases, I have had so many people say to me, well, it doesn't really matter if I visit my grandma because she's just out to lunch. She doesn't know anything. She doesn't recognize anybody. She doesn't even know if I'm coming or not. That is a myth that's absolutely not true. I have seen it over and over and over. And even though it's not obvious to you or to me or to anybody that they are aware of what's going on around them, they're still a thriving person inside there. They just may not be, giving you signs, body language, or, facial expressions or hand gestures. By then, a lot of people are not able to communicate verbally, but they're in there. And that's a myth that I really would love to dispel, because it is still important to go visit that person, even if it's not obvious that they're aware of your being. They are. And it is really helpful to them to still have that connection with people.
Yeah. I gotta tell you a personal story if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to hear
I mentioned
it.
I just turned 40. So in August, it was my birthday, and I was doing a little getaway. My wife and my brother came along with me. We were driving to the coast, and my grandma calls me. So I put it on. I'm in the car, put it on speaker, and she wished me a happy birthday. And just the emotion I can hear in her voice, she was thinking about me and clearly had it probably written down on a calendar somewhere. So we had a quick little call. No more than an hour and a half later, calls me again. I pick it up like she never talked to me, wish me a happy birthday with the same love and emotion. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about here, is like those signs. We know the signs have been there for years for us with her. But
well, that's a really good example, a sign that it's probably more than just normal aging forgetfulness.
Yeah, absolutely. But to your point, like the love, the emotion, there's a person in there somewhere, and to still show up, it's very important.
It is. And I can't really understate that or overstate that, I guess. But that's one of the myths. There's a lot of them that have been circulating forever. This is exclusively an older person's disease. That's another one that's not true. It actually can hit any of us at any age, at any time. The early onset dementia is a more rare form of Alzheimer's disease than the traditional common one, which typically starts showing up when we turn 65 or older. But more and more people, for some reason, are being diagnosed with early onset. I
Mm.
went for decades. And, I try to stay on top of all these statistics because they change so rapidly. But the youngest person that I read that was diagnosed with early onset was 30. And then recently,
Wow.
somebody was just like a few months ago diagnosed with early onset at 19 years old.
What do you make of that?
I think that's not a great sign. And it tells me that maybe some of us are being more impacted by environmental factors, and it's really doing damage to our brains because we don't know exactly what causes Alzheimer's disease or any of these brain diseases, but one of the risk factors happens to be environmental, and that could explain why more younger people are starting to show signs at younger ages.
You argue that behaviors are communication. And I want you to walk us through how to respond to some of these patterns we might recognize, like hallucinations, delusions, wandering, sundowning, without escalating fear or conflict in the moment. So I don't know if there's any story that kind of captures this in action, but would love to hear your perspective on how to respond.
I'll use my experience with my grandmother, to illustrate three of those behaviors. But I do want to mention that when I first started 30 years ago doing what I do professionally, the belief back then was what was called reality orientation therapy. And what that meant is the approach that we believed, or people believed, therapists, and they taught, this is what they recommended family members do and caregivers do, is if you are experiencing a false belief or a hallucination by the person, your loved one, or the person you're caring for, the way to handle that is to steer them back into our reality. And we discovered through trial and tribulation and, through the school of hard knocks, that all that did was create anxiety and frustration and anger, and could even escalate into what we call a catastrophic reaction, where the person literally would have a meltdown because they were so frustrated that people didn't believe them and that they were trying to change their belief. Now, when I say steer them back into our reality, so our reality with living with a healthy brain is different from the reality of a person living with dementia, but it's still their reality. And they believe whatever it is they're telling you 1,000%. And we learned through reality orientation therapy that you cannot change the mind or the belief of a person living with dementia. There's nothing we can do or say. It's their truth and you can't change it. So, how do you handle that? You do what we now practice called join their reality. And their truth, their reality. So, with my grandmother telling me that birds were living in her mattress, now that's a false belief. It's not a hallucination, it was a false belief. And she believed it to be true. She actually believed she felt the birds pecking at her face. She was always scared. She couldn't sleep. She didn't know how to deal with it. She had no idea how to get rid of these birds that were coming in and out of her mattress. And she 100% believed that this was happening to her. She was even calling the police like so many times a day. So what we discovered was there was no way I could not have said to her, Grandma, this is the craziest story I've ever heard. There's no way that birds could be living in your mattress and just coming out at night and pecking at your face. That's just absurd. That's the wrong response because she believed it. And that is the important point. So she could have snapped out of that. It could have just been a temporary false belief, and then she'd come back and be aligned with my reality. What are you talking about? Birds can't live in somebody's mattress. But as long as she insisted that that was going on, I knew, or, it's obvious that that was her truth for the time. So you have to listen for their cues. So joining their reality means that you acknowledge her feelings. So, for me to say, oh, Grandma, that must be horrible. That must be terrifying for you. Let's figure out a way to get rid of these birds. So you want to respond with empathy and validation and go along with her belief. Even if you don't have to literally lie about it, but just by acknowledging and trying to offer help is different than saying, oh, yeah, I see the birds. No, you don't have to do that. Just acknowledge and validate. And then they will typically drop the subject. But I'll tell you, because it was really a cute story. I was only like 16 years old. I had just gotten my driver's license and I wanted to show that off to my grandmother. So I drove over to her house. She just lived a couple miles from me. And so I go in her living room and we're having this conversation. And she starts telling me about the birds and the rats. Lisa, you see the rats running all over my house? They're invading my space. That's a hallucination. And then the paranoia and suspiciousness that we commonly see with dementia was by her telling me that these men were breaking into her house. They were stealing her jewelry. She was convinced they were going to do away with her and just take over her life. And that's paranoia and suspiciousness, which is very common. So the key is all in how you respond to whatever their false belief, hallucination, et cetera, is. So with the bird situation, and I said, and the only reason why I did not argue with her and try to correct her was because I come from the generation where we were taught under no certain circumstances do you contradict your elders. You respect them to the fullest extent. So instead of arguing with her, I wanted to say, that's the craziest story I ever heard. But that's not what I was taught. So I said, oh my gosh, Grandma, that must be terrifying for you. Let's do this. I want to help you. Let's figure out a way that we can get rid of these birds so you can sleep again and not always be so scared. So I led her into her bedroom and I threw the covers off and I'm, looking everywhere for signs of birds, holes or, whatever. I even flipped the mattress so I could look underneath it. And I said to her, okay, Grandma, do you have any idea how they're getting in and out of your mattress? Because I'm not seeing anything. I said, if you can show me, then I can find somebody that can help us. And she looks at me and she says, well, they're there, Lisa. They're just very, very clever. And I learned later on through my professional career that people living with dementia, and when they believe something as wholeheartedly as they do believe whatever it is they're telling you, they become masterful at explaining away their story, just like she did. And that's what she came up with. And, really, when I look back, it was brilliant to try to explain away why I couldn't see any evidence of birds. So joining their reality, validating them, just acknowledging how they feel. You always want to approach their emotions before stating any facts. And then just join them where they're at in their reality. You're going to save yourself a lot of heartache, headache, and if you can turn the situation around into a very positive outcome instead of an escalated situation by, her getting more frustrated and feeling like, you're not listening to me, they're there, what's wrong with you, blah, 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 and then just really having kind of a meltdown about it. So this is how we turn these situations around. Another common belief I've experienced it over and over and over again with clients and even in my own family, is one of the false beliefs that we hear commonly is that a person with dementia, a lot of them at some point, just kind of out of the blue, just pops in their head. They believe that their late spouse is still alive. Now, this is a really important one to talk about because our instinctive response to being told that somebody's spouse is still alive and maybe waiting for them at home, and you know they've been gone for years, who would to be to correct them, right? And say, oh, Mom, don't you remember Dad died 5 years ago? Why would you think that he's at the store and going to be home, any minute? No, she believes he's still alive. So if I said that to her, it could be like she was hearing that her husband of 50, 60 years died and nobody told her. She's hearing it for the first time. What happened? Was there a car accident? Oh my God, why didn't anybody tell? And this is what you're setting yourself up for, especially when it's that belief. Why didn't anybody tell me he died? What's going on? And could just literally set them into a panic. Does that make sense? You see that? And why it's so important to meet them where they are and join their reality.
Yep. Absolutely. We're finding that too. Like in our experiences, like if you bring up past memories or try to bring her to like a different time, panic sets in, frustration sets in, and it just can completely trigger versus I remember we had a family barbecue a couple months ago and a beautiful day. She's looking up at the clouds and she's pointing out like, hey, that looks like an elephant or something like that. And we just joined her in that and just had her focus on whatever she was focused on. And we find that if you keep her in the present with whatever she's focused on, enjoying her reality, as you're saying, goes for a lot better day.
It really does. And the other point I want to make is if she said that one day and then you repeat the event and you remember that she has said, oh, look, that looks like a dolphin, and you bring it up, she might not remember that that's what she saw in the cloud. And she go, what are you talking about?
Yep. Exactly.
So you have to follow the cue of the person with dementia and go along with whatever their belief is at that moment, because that belief can change in a heartbeat. So it's really tricky. You really have to pay attention to what they're doing and what they're saying because it's so inconsistent. They can be in their truth and their belief 1 minute and then completely aligned with us in the next.
You mentioned earlier that by the time most people are diagnosed with one of these brain diseases, that it's usually later on in the stage than people really think. And I imagine that panic kind of sets in for a lot of people, but I think preparation is the antidote to the panic. What can we do as families and caregivers to set ourselves up for success when we get a diagnosis like this and we know that we're going to have to care for somebody that we love? And I'm thinking like, whether it's medical, legal, safety, you probably have to think of all of these things, but what are like a few things that we need to put in place?
I have spent so many years watching family members just be in a state of complete reaction when this touches their family. And they're constantly scrambling around trying to figure out, what do I do next? What can I expect? So my advice, for obvious reasons, has always been, if you get that diagnosis or if you're noticing symptoms and you haven't had an official diagnosis, but you're suspecting, okay, I'm seeing a decline, just like you've told me your grandma is obviously, declining, and you've noticed it over a certain period of time. The earlier you take care of legal documents so they can still be involved, have a conversation with them as early as you can, even if you're not seeing any signs of cognitive decline, to find out what their end of life wishes are. Because I've seen so many family members that they have not done that. And then they're put in the situation where they have to make decisions about their mom or about their dad or their grandparents. And they're not feeling 100% secure that they're following what their parents would have liked.
And I imagine that's where siblings get in fights and family dynamics get all out of whack because they can't agree on it because it was never stated up front.
So the earlier we can have those conversations as a family and write them down while they're still, of sound mind, then we can follow to the best of our ability what they wished for or requested or really, made it clear that they don't want this, they don't want that. And then have those conversations with an elder care attorney and find out what documents do we need to take care of early on. Do we need a power of attorney? Do we need a medical power of attorney? Do we, want to fill out a post form or have our doctor do that? And be aware of the documents that could impact your particular family situation. And then be prepared. And as they do progress through the stages of dementia, they will, because it's irreversible. Some of those documents may be necessary later on, but find out up front. And the same with, their financial assets. And so that's one recommendation. And then the other thing that I strongly advise is, and I said this before, and I've given a lot of reasons why, educate yourself as much as you possibly can about what it's really like to live with a brain disease that causes dementia. What are the signs? How to recognize the symptoms and the behaviors. And so you're maybe expecting them instead of, okay, what's this now? And then you can be more prepared and proactive to know exactly how to respond to a false belief, how to respond to a hallucination. And I suggest assembling a toolbox for yourself. And what I mean by that is, okay, if the person you're caring for just out of the blue refuses to let you give them a shower and you have no idea why. I mean, it just came out of nowhere, dug their heels into that floor and just refused. Something triggered that behavior. They're not just trying to be difficult. Something triggered the behavior. And unfortunately, it's up to us as family members and caregivers to find out what just happened. Why all of a sudden is she being just absolutely set in her decision that she is not going to step into that shower? So if you have some tools in your toolbox to pull out and that you can effectively respond to that, how to turn the situation around, what you exactly step by step you should do, then you could, be successful in mitigating that situation at that moment. Now, the one thing that I should kind of warn people is if that refusal to take a shower happens again on a different day, something else could have triggered it. And the tool that you pulled out to solve that problem, a couple days earlier worked, it might not work the next time. So that's why we need to assemble a toolbox and have something else to pull out of that toolbox to try. Because every situation, even if they look alike or they're similar, the circumstances are going to vary situation to situation. So what works one time just may not have any effect the second time. So we want to have as many tools available to ourselves to try to see if it helps on this given situation.
With the time we have left, I want to sort of pivot or transition into the workplace. This podcast is all about creating a great workplace culture. And at the heart of that are people. And as we're talking about with people who have a brain disease, whether it's dementia or Alzheimer's, the caregivers are likely employees. They're likely leaders of people, and they're bringing this stuff to work. They may not talk about it, but they're bringing the situations and things in their life back to work and thinking about it, and it's probably adding on tons of stress. So I want to just talk about, from your perspective, what does compassion and flexibility in these sort of situations look like in an ideal state for these caregivers who are dealing with this, and like what should a manager or leader be doing in order to empathize and have that compassion?
That's such a great question. And my answer to that is in any workplace, corporate workplace, whether it's a large one or a small one, I think it's going to be really helpful for families or people caring for people that have these diseases to have resources and support resources available so they do have access to knowing what to do to better the situation, to take some of the stress off of them. And there are resources out there that can accomplish that. So if we see more of those available in, through human resources, through, even having a video library of things that they can tap into, would be extremely helpful and beneficial to anybody who's going through this because it is such a stressful situation. And another thing that people are dealing with is what we call the sandwich generation, where an adult is still raising children in their own home.
Yes.
And then they have a parent who is needing their supervision and decisions to be made, and it's just overwhelming. So having, a library of resources for them to know where they can find solutions is something that is just really now starting to be put into place, but it hasn't been for decades and decades and decades.
Yeah. I think people are willing to talk about it now. I think a lot of employers are waking up to the fact that, like, hey, we're real people, and these real people are coming to work and they have real lives and they're caring for people, whether it's their kids or a declining parent. And I think employers are now willing to put these resources together, like their own sort of toolbox for employees.
And one of the things that we're seeing, and this is also a true fact, is caregivers and family members, especially if you're in a sandwich, if you're, stuck in the middle of this sandwich situation, they're taking on so much stress being sandwiched in between two generations that we're seeing them become ill more often. We're seeing caregivers pass away before the people they're taking care of because of the stress that's on them. And part of it is because they have no way to vent. They have no way to receive any empathy. Like, oh gosh, I understand. They feel like they're just on an island all by themselves, having to deal with everything all by themselves. And it becomes like a cancer inside you.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and I see that I've watched that for years, decades. Yeah, so a lot of these things that we're talking about, Brandon, would be very helpful to people who are in this situation. And the thing that's really concerning, we're being told that just in the next 25 years, if a cure or a treatment is not found, and we're being told this by the World Health Organization and all of the Alzheimer's societies and associations, that the projected number of people who will develop just Alzheimer's disease, we're not even talking about the other brain diseases, is expected to triple worldwide by the year 2050. So if things are difficult now, just imagine that really, I call it the tsunami on its way of Alzheimer's disease. Yeah. But we're not close to a cure. We're not close to a treatment even. We don't even know what actually causes Alzheimer's disease. So that statistic is very scary. And we as a society, we're not prepared for the number of people who are expected to develop these brain diseases. So that's why we need to talk about it.
We need to keep talking about it. And if you could just end this conversation with those who might be caregiving right now and they don't have anything in place, maybe give somebody an action item, like what one or two or three things that should they do right away to set themselves up for success. It's not the right way to put that, but to make things a little easier.
Number one is to pay closer attention to yourself And I know that
That's good advice.
a lot of people, their feeling or their thought to that was, oh yeah, well, that's a lot easier said than done. It is, but you have to draw boundaries for yourself and take care of yourself. Just like you're taking care of that person, take care of yourself too, because, this can eat at you more than you might think. So you can, find ways to release your stress, join a support group. They're online now. I used to lead support groups, and what a difference people would tell me. I was for family members and caregivers. And just to hear other people's stories and how they handled it, and to feel like, oh, I'm not the only one that's going through this. And then to get professional help, like I could suggest ways to deal with that situation. So it was a learning experience and also a support network. So that's something I would highly recommend. And you can do them online now. So you don't even have to physically go someplace like when I used to lead them. I would say that those are probably the two most important things. Take time for yourself. Find somebody that maybe can give you a break, even if it's only for a few hours. Those things are really, really important to keep at the top of your mind for your own, health's sake.
Lisa, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you adding so much value to the audience. Those who are most likely going through this. I mean, I feel like I know everybody knows somebody who within their network that is faced with this, and I appreciate the resources. Your book is called Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's. It's Secret Faces, co-authored with Douglas Collins. Where can people connect with you if they want to learn more about you? We'll make sure to put a link to the book if they want to get it. Any other things you want to point to?
Well, my website, www.mindingdementia.com. And my podcast is a great resource for people. That's all I talk about every single week is some aspect of living with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And we cover everything from, everything we've talked about on the show today, plus, more to keep people informed, well-informed, and to be a reliable resource if you're going through this to help make it a little easier.
My guest today has been Lisa Skinner. Lisa, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks again for having me, Brandon. It's been a true pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.